Hi, this is Module 5, our readings video for Module 5, dealing with justice. I actually think that this week, the 5 readings, and one of the readings is a video, I hope that the connections are pretty self-explanatory between these 5 pieces. And I may be biased, but I actually think that they're some of the most, well, maybe not the tuck and yang. Tuck and yang are always difficult, but otherwise, I feel like they're some of the most straightforward readings in terms of understanding the core ideas of the authors. So, I want to take a few minutes to talk about the key ideas to help you check your understanding and about how these pieces fit together, as well as fit with other readings from our course thus far. So I'm going to start where the readings start with the piece by Dowd and Ben Simon. So this is actually from a book on engaging the race question in higher education. And they raise a point in their book that is often made, actually, when we talk about justice or social justice, particularly in relation to education, which is we don't define what we mean. We kind of use that phrase, social justice, and it's left as a stand-in, as a signifier, but we often don't articulate what it is that we're trying to signify with that phrase, social justice. So Dowd and Ben Simon are really trying to help us understand what is it that this would look like in an educational setting. Now, they're specifically writing about higher education, but what they say is applicable to K-12 and broadly to educational spaces, right? So community education spaces, adult education spaces, etc. Basically, Dowd and Ben Simon look broadly at theories of justice and social justice and articulations of justice and social justice and come up with 3 overarching ways in which we work for justice in educational spaces, or framed differently, 3 different key frame or pieces of a framework for thinking about justice in educational spaces. So the first is justice as fairness. For those of you here who are my philosophers or my political science or political theorists in the group, this is probably the tenet that you're most familiar with, because often when we talk about justice in a US context, we talk about John Rawls. John Rawls' seminal piece, A Theory of Justice, I believe it's from 1971 originally. He made an argument about understanding justice as a kind of fairness, right? Which in some ways is really commonsensical, but he goes beyond the language of common sense. And Dowd and Ben Simon talk a little bit about some of the philosophical framework of this. We're not reading Rawls, in part because I actually think it's really hard to read Rawls without reading him, right? Really digging into that giant tome, A Theory of Justice. And so I thought that Dowd and Ben Simon provided an adequate summary of Rawls's work. Sorry, I think felt like there was a spider on my foot. I think that they provide an adequate summary of Rawls's work to give you an idea of what he's trying to say. It's not a thorough representation. So I say that again for my philosophers and political scientists, political theorists, to know that I recognize how shallow this discussion of Rawls is. But basically, Rawls asks us to think about fairness and justice by imagining what he calls the original position. The original position is prior to any social demarcations, right? So he's engaged in a thought experiment. Prior to any social demarcations, here we have a community of people. What sort of decisions would that community make about resources and opportunities? And can we put ourselves in that original position to understand what we would believe about how resources and how opportunities should be shared in a community or among a society? And as he goes through this thought experiment and layers of it, he comes to a point which in many ways sums up Rawls's argument of justice, particularly as related to education. which is that when inequalities arise, that those inequalities should be leveraged to the benefit of the least advantaged. So let me say that again. That when inequalities arise, that those inequalities should be leveraged or used to the benefit of the least advantaged. That can take us in a lot of different paths, but it's an argument about redistribution, ultimately, right? That when we see inequalities in our community or in our society, Rawls's theory of justice, which is in many ways the dominant theory of justice in the United States, particularly because it grows from the liberal democratic tradition. But Rawls's understanding is that when we see inequalities, in order to fix them, we actually are going to take those inequalities and use them to benefit people who have otherwise been harmed. Okay, there are other ways to think about fairness, of course. And Dowd and Ben-Simon talk a little bit about Nancy Fraser, who is a critical theorist, a critical philosopher, who reminds us that fairness, that while redistribution of resources and opportunities is necessary, it is not enough on its own to produce justice. And Nancy Fraser would tell us that fairness is not only about redistribution, but it's also about recognition within the community, recognition of one's different lived experiences and identities, and then, and respect for them, right? And then that where there is difference in the community, that we experience representation, that we see ourselves reflected back in relationships of power, in inequalities, right? About who is leveraging that power, who's making decisions, that we see ourselves in the community, literally, right? And so often Nancy Fraser talks about this in terms of who are we electing in office, and how can our elected officials represent physically, demographically, racially, in terms of gender or sex, right? How can they represent literally the people that are voting for them, right? So Fraser talks about redistribution, representation, and recognition. All of this is still in an idea of fairness, of getting us to think about what would be fair in our social structures, right? How do we maneuver and manipulate and change what we're doing now towards fairness? Now, the second principle, justice is care, you should recognize the stamp of Nell Noddings here in her Ethic of Care. Nell Noddings also talked about Angela Valenzuela's work, and that's mentioned here as well, this idea of critical care. That justice is care is not so much concerned, although they overlap, but justice is care is about relationships. It's about listening, right? That receptive listening that we've been writing about in D2L. It's about hearing the expressed needs of people and communities, particularly those who have been marginalized, and meeting those needs, right? It is about caring for the people and the communities. Fairness is part of that work. And justice as care influences how we think about fairness and vice versa. But it's its own principle. It's about relationships. And then the third principle, justice is transformation, I think that you can see some recognition there with Audre Lorde's work and with Gloria Ladson-Billings' work. Because justice is transformation says this system that we live in is unjust. There is injustice. And we can redistribute, and we can engage in acts of recognition and representation and care within this system. But it itself needs transformation, particularly related to race, right? And so remember, Dowd and Ben-Simon are writing about addressing the race question in higher education. And their theory of justice ultimately comes back to this idea of that we have to transform the racial structures in our society. And we have to acknowledge them, right? We have to see them first in order to transform them. Okay, so that ties in then to the next piece, by Lacey on Eacuria, the Jesuit priest, right, who ran UCA, the University of Central America. He is one of the Jesuit martyrs from San Salvador. I can't talk tonight, from San Salvador. And meaning he was murdered in El Salvador in the early 80s, I believe it was, for his work related to liberation theology and on behalf of justice through the University of Central America. So in this piece, it's really trying to lay out Eacuria's vision of justice through his Jesuit lens and through his work as a university rector, right? How did Eacuria understand the work of a Jesuit university, of a university in general, but specifically a Jesuit university, towards justice? And part of what this author lays out is kind of where all three of those dimensions of justice, right? In understanding that the world as it is needs transformation, that we have duties to care within that, and that there's duties to work and to manipulate, right, to redistribute, to engage in fairness, but also this sense, Eacuria really talks about this twofold, that we have to engage in what I believe we read Bettina Love next week, who will introduce us to this phrase of freedom dreaming. So Eacuria is really asking us to engage in freedom dreaming. What can be? What can a just world look like? If we are Catholic and Jesuit and believe in Catholic social teaching and believe in the gospel, right? It's not just what can a just world look like, but what can a purified, godly, loving world look like, right? So we have to imagine that. And then Eacuria reminds us, but we also have to understand that we live in a world with constraints. So how do we move from this world of constraints toward this imagining of liberation? And one of the ways that Eacuria calls on us to engage in this work, which again should be familiar if we think back to the article on liberation, theology, and pedagogy by Stenberg from a couple of sessions ago, he calls on us to listen most carefully to those who are marginalized or oppressed, right? To enact a preference for the poor. That in order to engage in this freedom dreaming, to think about what is possible, we have to listen and make space, right, in our work for those who experience injustice to tell us what their freedom dreams are. And that we then work in solidarity with them towards those freedom dreams. That idea of solidarity is throughout Eacuria's philosophy as represented in this piece. Now, he's also talking about schooling, though, and then what is the role of the university in this? And so specifically, the university's role is to take the space, the intellectual and the community space that we have to interrogate these questions around freedom dreaming, around systems that oppress, around preference for the poor, but to bring to bear on that all of the knowledge, disciplinary knowledge, empirical understanding. So it's not instead of a university education. It's about a university education in the service of justice and in the service of these questions. So Eacuria, you should see a lot of connections there between Dowd and Ben Simon, between Stenberg, when she talked about liberation theology and pedagogy, with Sepulveda and pedagogy of accompaniment. I can't say acompañamiento in Spanish without stumbling. So a pedagogy of acompañamiento from Sepulveda, this idea of solidarity, of walking with. And that's really where this idea comes from, right? Is liberation theology. And this idea, I already said, epistemic privilege. We'll look at freedom dreaming next week. But also Anzalua, right? And this idea of what is it when we are free to speak with our whole selves? What is it that is released? And that also connects to Tuck and what Tuck has said in the last week about desire and about moving beyond damage, right? So even in Eakuria's framework, where he's talking about a preference for the poor, it's not to say that I'm here to save you, to see you as damaged, you are poor, I save you. Instead, it's to say, I recognize that there are systems of oppression and that different people experience those systems differently, and some are marginalized and harmed by those systems, and that our source for freedom dreaming should come from them, and that we work in solidarity. And so for Eakuria, this is justice as God's work, right? But you should see parallels through all of these readings we've been doing in that idea. Okay, Audre Lorde shares a pragmatic concern with Eakuria in the title of her talk, right? But in her main line, and this is a line that you may have heard, you may have read this piece before, but where she asks, is it possible to dismantle the master's house with the master's tools? She says no, right? She says the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Now, in this piece, she's talking specifically about ideas of identity and intersectionality. And specifically, she's talking to white feminists in this piece who are engaged in a form of justice work. This is from the 1980s, this piece. But calling on them to say, your idea of justice is so narrow because you are envisioning it within the master's house. You are still, in the case of Audre Lorde's piece, where she's talking to a conference of white feminists, you are still all white feminists. Do you understand how that limits your vision of both what is wrong in the world and what is possible in the world? And she goes on to talk about how we then have to imagine and we have to come up with new ways of transforming our world. Specifically around difference, she talks about, and here you should see a connection to Bell Hooks writing in Beloved Community, saying this isn't about erasing difference. That notion of erasing difference is, according to Audre Lorde, one of the master's tools. It's one of the ways that systems of oppression are reinforced, according to Audre Lorde and according to Bell Hooks, right? And that in fact, we need a different relationship to difference. For Bell Hooks, that means embracing difference and understanding that that's where creativity and generativity comes from, which is also what Audre Lorde says. So this element of within justice, that there has to be discord, that justice is not about blind harmony and smoothing over disagreement, different identities, different racial differences. It's not about erasing them, but about leaning into that discord to understand what can be possible, to create something new. All of this should then help set the stage for the Gloria Ladson-Billings video and the main point there, which again is in the title, where she tells us that social justice isn't enough. That it's not that it's inherently not enough, but the way that it has been taken up is problematic. And so what we need to attend to is justice. Plain old justice. Justice, just justice is what she says over and over and over again, right? That's her refrain. And she goes on to show how social justice just isn't a robust enough idea to capture the multitude of injustices that are experienced, in particular by people of color, in the United States. And she also goes on to say that social justice, as we conceive of it, is a really Western, Eurocentric, Americentric idea, and that there are very rich notions of justice elsewhere in the world that we can turn to understand how to bring justice to life. And she quotes Amartya Sen, an economist and a philosopher from India, who reminds us that justice should not just be a theory, but it's about the way that people's lives go. And this is so critically important, and I think it connects to Eakuria. I think it connects to Dawn Ben-Simon. It connects to a piece that we don't read, but by Nancy Fraser, who is a philosopher and a theorist. All of these people over and over are saying that justice is, like, we can theorize it in the abstract, but what justice ultimately is about the overcoming and the inversion of injustice. So we have to first identify where an injustice is. And how do we do that if we are not the person or the group experiencing the injustice? That's where epistemic privilege comes in. So we have to identify the injustice, dream about what should be there instead of that injustice, and then work in solidarity towards it. So in many ways, Ladson Billings is saying something very similar to Ea Curia, to Daoud Ben Simon, and even to Audre Lorde, right? But they're saying this in really different ways. And finally, we end with Tuck and Yang. And I include this here because it's a really powerful and important reminder. And often when we start thinking about liberation and justice in schooling, this word or this idea of decolonization comes up. But what Tuck and Yang are reminding us of is that these are not just ideas, that these are material, right? Specifically in the case of decolonization, when often that word gets thrown around, right? Decolonize the curriculum, decolonize education, decolonize a city, and what Tuck and Yang say over and over again in this article is that this is not a metaphor for social transformation. Decolonization has a very specific meaning, and that specific meaning is about the material repatriation of land and resources to indigenous people, and it's about the re-entrenchment isn't the word I'm looking for, but it's about sort of honoring the sovereignty of indigenous peoples. So it's about centering indigenous peoples, repatriating land, repatriating resources, so giving them back material things, and honoring treaties so that indigenous communities, indigenous nations are actually sovereign, right? The reason I include this here is because it calls on us to ask ourselves, when we talk about justice, are we just talking theoretically? Or do we understand that there are material actions and consequences for these theories, and what would they look like in education? Okay, so that's a lot of ideas in these readings, and I hope that this was similar to what you got out of the readings. The film this week, The Home Stretch, is a challenging application of them because it's really a story about injustice. It's a story about injustice in Chicago schooling. We are going to meet with three homeless teenagers who are just trying to graduate high school. So they're working very hard to make it through this system of injustice within education and within society at large, to just make it through to the next step. It's not about social transformation per se. And so the question is thinking about, how does what we're seeing with the students in the home stretch, how does that illustrate what is possible and what is challenging, what is impossible in work for justice? Is there a way to engage in justice work at any of these levels in education? So this is heady stuff that I hope, again, you see bringing in all of what we've been talking about, right? We talked about epistemology in Ea Curia, in Audre Lorde. We're talking about care throughout all of these. We're looking at liberation, right? I'm missing something. Purpose. The purpose of education, right, is in here as Ea Curia is talking about how is justice the purpose of education. So I really hope that in this module, Module 5, you begin to see how these concrete ideas start to come together. In our next module, we're really then going to look at how they come together specifically in an articulation of quality. What is a high quality education in relation to these various ideas? So, long again, I'm sorry. There's much for us to pack in when we're doing a full semester in only 6 weeks, but I look forward to seeing what you have to say in your discussions and in your papers, and please reach out with questions as always.